Welcome back. You tune into the morning show right here on ETV. Well, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, also known as DIRCO, announced this month that it would continue to downgrade diplomatic relations with Israel after withdrawing the ambassador a year ago. Now, even though the department has received criticism for this, Phumlani Majozi, however, is a political analyst, and he thinks it is time that South Africa rethinks their relations with certain countries. And of course, he joins us in studio to tell us why. Phumlani, thank you for your time and welcome.
Great to be here. Great to see you.
First of all, before we even get to some of the countries that you feel South Africa should or should not be in relation to, why does South Africa get into relations with certain countries, be it in SADC, in the continent, in the world? Why is it important to have relations with, their global counterparts?
Look, we are part of a world, right? So we've got to have some relations, partly because there are things that we get from those countries, right? There are things that we also, for example, in terms of trade, one could argue that there are things that we cannot produce and therefore we have to buy from those countries. For example, oil, one could argue that. But also there are things that we have in terms of natural resources that we also sell to those countries. So one could argue that from having a relations point of view with other countries, that works as well because you've got to have some form of relations with those countries that you can trade with. But also there are issues that one sort of faces in different regions. For example, in Africa, you look at in terms of the East Africa, the Al-Shabaab there, sort of being a security threat in Somalia, in Kenya as well. The Boko Haram in Nigeria, sort of terrorizing people there, and also having some bases in countries like whether it's Cameroon, whether it's Niger, and so on. You also look at the conflict in Central Africa, right? So all these issues, there's going to be a partnership.
Some sort of an alliance.
Countries, an alliance of some sort, depending on where the situation is. And suppose that, for example, take an issue of Zimbabwe. We look at the past 15 years in Zimbabwe, things didn't go in the right direction there in terms of the economy, in terms of political instability as well. Therefore, we had to be involved. We had to work with some of the SADC countries, whether it's Mozambique, Botswana, and so on, to try and find a solution in the political situation in Zimbabwe. So there's got to be a partnership. As we in different regions in the world, especially in Africa as well, as we face whether it's political, whether it's issues of the economic problems that these countries face, there's got to be a partnership.
There has to be an alliance.
We can't live in an isolated
Absolutely. We're not an island. However,
we are not.
Cuba and Russia seems to be on your radar in terms of countries that South Africa should not be in an alliance with.
Well,
why?
I wouldn't say that we shouldn't be, but I was trying to say that what we should be looking into is that we should try and point them out whenever they are doing things that are sort of repressing human rights. At least when you look at South Africa's foreign policy, especially under Jacob Zuma, I would argue that we sort of leaned more towards Russia, China, Cuba, and so on.
We did.
Right, at the expense of our relationship with our sort of Western countries. And there's a reason for that, and I'll tell you why. As I say in my article, I build a context around the history of the Cold War. When you look at the Cold War, right, it was a matter of, as a country, as South Africa, are you either leaning towards the Soviet Union, led by Russia, or you are part of you are leaning towards the countries or the court of countries that were led by the United States. As I point out in the article, that the West wasn't there in our apartheid struggle. They were not there. No. We were in the wilderness. They had put Nelson Mandela on the terrorist
terrorism
list. Yes. But Cuba supported our struggle. Muammar Gaddafi was there. Even Yasser Arafat supported even Putin as well. He was sort of in the sub-Saharan Africa funding some movements that were fighting against one could argue anti-colonial movements. So that shaped our foreign policy in a sense that even today, that sort of determines as to how do we align. We are sort of very much aligned to countries that we believe were sort of supported us back then during our apartheid struggle. But that has to change because the global dynamics have changed. So we've got to look into, let's not only be sort of these loyal, give this unwavering support, whether it's in Cuba or Russia and so on. Let's point them out. Let's point Putin whenever he annexes Crimea and say that, this is not all right. You cannot just change international borders the way you want.
Okay.
Let's point him out if there are some sort of suspicious killings that takes place in his that are believed to be orchestrated or alleged to be orchestrated
but
by his.
Won't that affect relations that we have with them? Because sometimes the reason why, even I'm looking at this even personally, whether it's a relationship, business relationship, if you have interest invested, in this case, the BRICS interest that South Africa shares with Russia, wouldn't South Africa trade carefully, or DIRCO at least as a department, trade carefully in sort of interfering with those kind of conversations between Russia and Crimea because of the relationship that they share, the alliance that you mentioned?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, we've got to, at the end of the, look at how the U.S. handled the whole Jamal Khashoggi's killing, believed to be done by the Saudis. Even though they came out to condemn it, but at the end of the day, the Saudis are the central bank of oil in the world, right? So the United States had to try and balance that.
Right.
So the question for us is, how do we, as a country, sort of point out the human rights abuses, whether it's in Cuba, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's in Russia and so on, but at the same time also acknowledging that we've got to, at the end of the day, to try and trade with these partners, you know. So I'm trying to say let's use the institutions like the UN Security Council, right, to try and assert our voice and what we stand for.
Yeah.
We have said since 1994 that we are standing for human rights.
Right.
We are standing for reconciliation and so on and so on. But let's try and do that. And if we, for example, last year, when we sort of abstained from voting against Myanmar's activities that were taking place in terms of, you know, human rights abuses on Rohingya people there, it was shocking that because of public outcry, we had to reverse our vote a few weeks later.
South Africa seems to be decisive, though. I mean, under the same note, they seem to be decisive. When they downgraded the diplomatic, sort of like standing or relations with Israel, wasn't that a decisive sort of like perspective or stature that you received from South Africa, whereby they even had to retract their own ambassador a year ago because of where they stood between, the Palestinian and the Israel war happening there? Didn't you think South Africa was decisive in that sense?
Yeah, it was decisive, but I don't think South Africa is in a way handling the Israeli-Palestine issue in the right way. I was in Israel and Palestine last year, and I'll be honest with you. This is December, just past December. I was there to try and understand the conflict, right? And I think it's more complex than it seems out to be. You know, there is, at least in my view, what I saw there is that there's got to be a two-state solution, right? And if you want to achieve that, you've got to try somehow faced with the fact that there are nationalists from both sides. You know, one could argue that we have Hamas in the Palestinian side that continues to throw rockets into Israel, but also one could argue that there is this sort of what Israel, I believe, is wrong, has been doing in terms of extending the settlements into the West Bank and so on. So there's got to be, I've always said that between Israel and Palestine, I'm a person who's never been either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. I've said that there's got to be a solution because it's too much complex. At the end of the day, people of Palestine, they've got to have their own state, but also Israelis as well. So, and to get there, I think you've got to acknowledge that from both sides there has to be a compromise.
Yeah, and how does DIRCO then manage that relationship? Because at one point you have what's been happening with Zimbabwe asking for aid in terms of finance to the South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa is the president, them saying unfortunately they can't help, and Zimbabwe could easily equally say, but we were there for you during apartheid when you had to go into exile. Some of your political members came into our country. Now that we're going through a financial time, you're not there for us. How does DIRCO, or as a country, as South Africa, do we balance or manage relationships, do you think?
They always say that relationships, when it comes to international affairs, you cannot separate it from domestic politics or domestic policy, right? You've got to have the money if you want to somehow assist Zimbabwe, you know. If you want to involve whether it's a sub-Saharan crisis or somewhere in East Africa or West Africa, you've got to have the money as well. So the fundamental question and the key question that people are asking right now is how will things change under Ramaphosa in terms of foreign policy?
Yeah.
Right. Are we going to see that there's some hostility that we saw towards the West, that we saw under President Jacob Zuma, or is he going to somehow try and pursue a balanced foreign policy? And I think at the end of the day, it will all be constrained by our finances, by our policy, and we'll see how it goes.
We'll have to wait and see. Phumlani, but I appreciate this time. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.
All right then. Well, that's Phumlani M, who's joining us right here on The Morning Show, talking foreign policy, but also his article where he speaks about South Africa rethinking some of their relations with certain global countries. I'm talking about Cuba and Russia in this instance, and you can make sure that you read that particular article, but also stay tuned as we follow through in terms of foreign policies and how our president especially will be following through now that he's been on a tour to raise investment and funding for South Africa. But let's take a short break, and when we come back, I have your news at the top of the hour.